Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to talk about Exploration 2 and Exploration 3 from Lesson 3 in your book. And so if you're following along with your physical textbook, I'm on page 163 right now. 163. So as we all know, that plants cannot get up and move around. They can't choose to deposit their seeds in the perfect locations. Plants do depend on environmental conditions like water or the right amount of soil, the right type of soil for their reproduction. But they also may rely on insects, birds, mammals to carry and pollinate those plants so they can reproduce. Okay, so one example would actually be something called night blooming plants. Night blooming plants are usually pollinated by animals that are active at night, such as things like beetles, moths, or bats. And so, what traits might night blooming flower have to attract some nighttime feeders? Well, they might have very fragrant flowers or strong scents of their flowers to attract those nighttime pollinators. Or another might be that they might have a light color. And if they have that light color, they can be more easily seen in the dark. So, pollination and flowering plants. Um, why might it be beneficial for a plant to be able to self-pollinate as well as have adaptations that attract animal pollinators? Well, both of these pollination methods would enable the plant to reproduce under many conditions. It could replicate quickly or self-pollinate, or it could get more genetic diversity through cross-pollination. So what cross-pollination is if you have a pollinator, like a moth, like one of these moths here, that fly from one flower and get a little bit of the nectar, and then fly to another flower and another flower and another flower. It takes a little bit of that pollen, and a little bit of that pollen gets trapped on that pollinator, that moth right there, and it carries that little bit of pollen between flower and flower. And so you may have the ability that a flower can actually get pollen from a different plant that was actually a long ways away through the use of this pollinator. And that can actually increase the genetic diversity in that plant. And it can actually make it so it can get new genetic traits and actually maybe help it survive in the future. And so that can be very beneficial. Okay, so the different parts of a flower, you have the male and female parts, the stamen and the pistil, and a lot of times you have a pollinator. So things like a butterfly here, for example, this is the pollinator here. It could be insects, it could be mammals, it can be birds, they can all do that. And so one example for a bird would be this flower right here. Okay, so this is a flower that's found in some rainforests in Central America. And so if you look at the shape of that flower, so it's a long kind of curved shape here to get down to the bottom of it. And so if you look at these animals here, well, the one that is actually able to best pollinate that would be this hummingbird. See, the shape of its beak is very much the same as the shape of this flower, and that actually happens a lot. That the animal actually and plant actually will kind of evolve together and to get parts that would actually help match up to actually become one where this bird is actually, its purpose for this plant is to help pollinate this plant. And so that's actually really beneficial, and so that happens a lot. Okay, so we're actually going to skip the hands-on lab for right now, so you don't have to worry about the hands-on lab on page 165 or the top of page 164. But if we look at this evidence notebook, we'll talk about this question here. The sacred lotus plant is pollinated by bees and beetles. How do the traits of the sacred lotus flower help attract these pollinators? Well, it will have strong smells that attract insects. The color can help attract pollinators as well as the warmth. The warmth at night can help attract those insects like beetles, and they actually spend the night there in those flowers and actually help pollinate it. So seed dispersal of flowering plants can actually be dependent upon other organisms like birds. Okay, so this bird will actually eat the seeds of this plant and actually later excrete those seeds through its digestive system to a new location and actually help that plant survive and actually reproduce in new locations. Okay, so in what ways might the dispersal of seeds far from the parent plant be advantageous for the survival of the offspring? Well, this helps the offspring find a suitable growing environment, and it reduces the competition for resources, and so they're not going to be competing against each other. These plants aren't going to be competing against each other for those sometimes limited resources. And so many animals that disperse plant seeds are birds or mammals. Some insects and fish can also spread seeds. Ants, for example, carry seeds underground. And so how might this method of dispersal help seeds survive? And so if we had buried seeds, so if we had ants actually carry it underground and seeds get buried, they have access to the soil, they have access to nutrients, and they'd also be protected from things like cold, fire, or seed-eating animals. And so that can actually help that plant then grow right away. And so actually kind of those ants act as planters for that plant, which is kind of neat. So if we look at this, we analyze the honeybee colony loss. Okay, so if we look at this chart, so we have acceptable levels of bees here. Okay, we have the winter loss, what happens, and we have the total annual loss. Okay, so what percentage, our question here is what percentage of acceptable loss is estimated from 2006 to 2007 and 2007 to 2008 when the CCD was first reported? And how much did the total winter loss estimates for these years exceed this expectation? During which years was the difference between the acceptable loss and the total winter loss the greatest? And so if we look at this, the acceptable loss between 2006, 2007, 2008 was about 15%. So if we look at this, the acceptable level of loss, we're about 15% right there. So that goes up to that 15%. The total winter loss from 2006 to 2007, if we look at this, was 32%, and 2007 to 2008 was 36%. So if we look at the total winter loss, that's the blue column. We look here, we're at about 32. We're kind of estimating that one right there, 32. And we look at this one, 36. Kind of estimating that one as well. So in the 2007 to 2008, it had the greatest difference. Okay, so if we look at this between 2007 and 2008, we had the greatest difference in that, in the total acceptable loss and the total winter loss there. And so look at number 15 here. What was the average total annual loss over the years for which this data was reported? And what was the average total winter loss over the same time period? And what does this tell you about the contributions of winter and summer losses to the total annual losses over this time? Well, the average, if we kind of average these out, the average total annual loss was 37%. And the average total winter loss was 26%. So the winter months account for most of the losses of these insects. So of these bees, we can actually tell that the winter loss was actually quite a bit higher, and so most of the loss comes from the winter months. So if we look at exploration 3 here, what are some of the factors that can affect plant growth? Well, we know plants need things like air, sunlight, water, space, soil, nutrients to grow. So if we were to explain how seed germination is caused by a combination of genetic and environmental factors, well, genetic factors determine the environmental condition. Genetic factors determine the environmental conditions and the process required for germination. Environmental factors, these things indicate the conditions required for germination are favorable and trigger the germination process. And so genetic factors kind of determine what environmental conditions and processes would be needed for that plant to grow. And then those environmental factors actually then trigger, when the environmental conditions get right, it actually triggers that seed to actually start to germinate and actually start to grow. So genetic factors can actually affect plant growth. So genetic factors can affect plant growth. Okay, and so different species of plants have different genetic factors that may affect its growth. May affect some plants to grow taller than others, or spread out more than others, create vines or more tree-like trunks. Okay, so one of the things that affect the plant growth are things like hybrids. Okay, so plant hybrids are where plant breeders can actually cross-pollinate different types of plants in order to produce a desired trait or traits of the offspring. So they might try to introduce resistance of disease, drought, or pests by creating a hybrid. So they take two species and they actually cross two different species and create a new plant called a hybrid. Okay, and so tomatoes are one example of hybrids. We have a lot of hybrid tomatoes. So heirloom tomatoes, you may have heard of heirloom tomatoes, are valued for their taste, color, and kind of their unusual appearance. Okay, we have different types of these tomatoes here, so Sun Gold, Grape, Juliet tomatoes, and they all are these hybrids that make them resistant or better in one form or another. So how might a cross between a Sun Gold tomato and Juliet tomato result in a desirable hybrid? And so if we look at the Sun Gold tomato, they're very sweet and tolerant of cooler temperatures. Juliet tomatoes are sweet, small, and resistant to disease. And so this hybrid might be sweet, it could be cold tolerant, and it could be resistant to pests, which actually be a very beneficial thing for a tomato or a plant to be. So it might be able to gain a desirable trait. So a tomato breeder has noticed that a hybrid is not attracting pollinators to its flowers. What genetic change may have occurred in this hybrid, and what does that mean for the long-term survival of the hybrid? Well, it could be a change in the nectar or the pollen or the flower color or odor, and then if it's not attracting any pollinators, the survival is threatened because it may not be able to reproduce. So plants still must have those be able to attract those pollinators. So environmental factors can also affect plant growth. So drought is a great example that can affect plant growth. So if plants don't get enough water, they're of course going to suffer in their growth. Okay? Or sometimes some plants, if they get too much water, the opposite of that drought, that can actually affect those plants too. Maybe they're made and designed and have the traits for drier conditions. And if they have more than rain or moisture than what is normally required, it may actually have detrimental effects to that plant as well. And so if we look here at some conditions and the effect on the growth. So if we have nutrient-rich organic matter that was added to the soil, well, that's going to probably increase our growth. Okay, if we have the habitat is experienced rainfall levels well below normal for that year, we're going to probably see decreased growth then for that plant. They're not going to have enough moisture. If we have many seeds that fell near the parent plant, germinated and began to grow, you're probably going to see decreased growth because you're going to see a lot more competition for those resources for that plant. If we have tall trees that grow around the plant, we're going to probably see some decreased growth as well because those tall trees are going to use up that sunlight and that plant is not going to be able to receive as much sunlight. So if we look at aspen growth here, aspen trees, they're a type of native tree that lives in cold regions. They're often called a pioneer species. They populate areas that have recently lost vegetation to erosion, fire, disease, and they can provide a covering for conifer seedlings. But they often die out as the conifers take over an area. And so the aspens can actually reproduce sexually, but can actually also reproduce asexually by sending up multiple stems in their root system. And so if we look here, mountain aspens are often used to landscape homes in lower elevation suburban or urban areas. What factors might affect the growth of the mountain aspen in their new habitat? Well, temperature is a big one. So they're kind of made for colder areas. If they're not planted in colder areas, that can affect their growth. The amount of sunlight, or the amount of rainfall that may receive, that can all affect the aspen tree's growth. Would you expect an aspen tree to be able to tolerate shade? Why or why not? And really, they are dependent and adapted to live in the open and not adapted to live in competition for sunlight. So they're what we call a pioneer species. They're one of the first trees that come in, and then as other trees grow, they actually can outcompete an aspen tree. And so those aspens may then die off. So small groves of aspen trees that appear to be separate trees may be multiple stems attached to one extensive underground root system. Would you expect individuals in a grove to be able to adapt to a change in the environment? And why? And well, if they're all actually connected to one giant root system, would they be able to adapt? And the answer is probably no, because they reproduce asexually, so they will not have genetic adaptations that would allow them to survive environmental changes. They would actually all be very close to the same genetically. And so if there's a change, they wouldn't have the genetic resources, the genetic diversity to actually resist that change and actually be able to survive. So the entire population may be in danger of dying off. All right, guys, that's the end of the Exploration 3. for this week. Thanks for all your hard work, and like always, if you have any questions, please contact your teacher.